So let me introduce our first speaker. So Rafal Bogacz, what do you pronounce your last name? Bogacz, okay, that's what I've been saying, good. Rafal Bogacz, he did his bachelor's in computer science from Wrocław University of Technology in Poland. And he got a bronze medal in the IOI statistics. That's the International Olympiad of Informatics. I know everything. I know everything. In 1990 and 1992. So congratulations for that. He has a PhD in computational neuroscience from the University of Bristol, which is in the United Kingdom. And he did a postdoc at Princeton in applied math and psychology jointly. So put a pin in that. I'll come back later. In 2004, he became a lecturer and then subsequently a reader in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Bristol. And that's where I met Rafal. In 2013, I went to the University of Bristol for a sabbatical. And in 2013, he left the University of Bristol and went to Oxford. So that was, I wasn't happy about that. I mean, we just started to get to know each other and he had to leave, so, okay. Well, here he is now. It's actually, to be honest, it's after that I've been following your work more, so that's fine. In 2019, he became a professor, capital P professor, of computational neuroscience at the MRC Brain Network Dynamics unit at Oxford. And he's on the editorial board of the Journal of Mathematical Psychology, so that pin was. And so I've been interested in Rafal's work for a long time now. And what I really appreciate about it is he's doing like cutting edge neural network work, but it's always related to the brain. Like there's a lot of work out there, neural networks, you know, generative models and all sorts of people solving amazing problems in finance and natural language processing and stuff like that. But most of those people don't give a crap about the brain. It's interesting work, but I'm interested in the brain, and Rafal's work always ties back to the brain. So he's doing things that are actually competing with or generating similar types of results, but in a way that the brain can actually compute. So that's what I really like about his work. One of, I think, his most amazing works was translating some of Carl Friston's work into a format that's understandable to humans. Before that, he collaborated with Kevin Gurney and Tobias Larson to show how the basal ganglia, that's part of the brain, could be involved in implementing reinforcement learning. Now it's before reinforcement learning was even cool. So I invited him to Brain Day in 2020. And unfortunately, at the time, he was in New Zealand on sabbatical, and which was okay because that Brain Day was canceled because of COVID, and so was the one after it. But I'm really delighted to have him here this year, finally. Please welcome Rafal Bogacz.
You can admire New Zealand in the meantime.
Ed, are you the host? Everything, but now anyone in the world can share this. Great.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for your extremely kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. It's really great pleasure for me to be here. Today, I would like to tell you about work in our group, addressing the question of what is the general principle brain employs for learning, and how the learning in the brain relates to learning in artificial neural networks used in machine learning. And most of the work which I will present was led by a talented former PhD student, Yu-Hang Song. So throughout our life, we have to continuously learn and correct errors in our predictions, even though we acquired already a lot of knowledge during our lifetime. And it happened to me yesterday. I was flying from London with Air Canada, and during my flight, I had this wonderful in-flight entertainment system, which had destination guides. And I was browsing these destination guides, and suddenly saw a picture of this beautiful place. And I looked at this, and my brain thought, oh, this looks like a wonderful exotic location. Probably it's somewhere in Greece. But then I read the description, and it turns out this is here in Ontario. So I had to really kind of update my model of the world and modified some synaptic weights in my brain. But this is not a trivial issue to solve, because as you probably know, our visual system is very complicated. It has this kind of hierarchical organization, and information about the image was provided from the screen to my retina, while probably some of my language areas provided information on the location to higher associative areas. And somewhere the brain had to modify some connections between these input layers and this top layer. So the problem of which connections to modify and how is known as the credit assignment problem. So how can we solve the credit assignment problem? So in machine learning, a solution for credit assignment, which is often known, is the backpropagation algorithm, which is typically used to train artificial neural networks. And given the success of this algorithm and amazing results which we can achieve with it, in recent years, a lot of interest in neuroscience has been focused on trying to see if maybe the brain is doing something similar. And in fact, several people, including myself, were interested in the question how we could approximate something like backpropagation algorithm in biologically plausible neural networks. And even though these models which have been developed not always implement the backpropagation algorithm exactly, they often approximate it, and much emphasis is placed on how close this approximation is. However, we know that learning in the brain is superior than backpropagation in many respects. For example, we require less training data, and there's less interference during learning. So should the focus of the field, of the computational neuroscience field, will really be on trying to seeking the backpropagation implementation in our brain? So during this talk, I would like to claim that the answer to this question should be no. And I would like to argue that the brain is using fundamentally different learning principle, which we called prospective configuration. So I will try to explain what it is and show you how this principle can arise from simple networks of neurons. And then I will try to demonstrate that it allows more effective learning than backpropagation in many situations, which are the type of situations animals and humans have to face in the wild. And that this mechanism can better explain data from behavior and neural activity in learning tasks than the backpropagation algorithm. And if you have any questions at any time or would like to make a comment, feel free to interrupt as we go. Okay, so what is prospective configuration? So let me just kind of contrast it with backpropagation, which is the kind of classical algorithm for training artificial neural networks. So probably many of you are familiar with this, and you know that what backpropagation is trying to do is trying to modify the weights to minimize the error made by the network on the output. So basically, what backpropagation is doing is just for each weight is trying to think, how will I modify this way to minimize this error on the output, and does it kind of independently for each weight, and then kind of moves the weights in this direction. Now, what prospective configuration is doing something similar but slightly different. So before modifying the weights, in prospective configuration, you first will adjust the neural activity in all layers such that the network makes the correct prediction on the output. And only once you adjusted the activity, you will modify the weights to modify the pattern which you achieved. Right? So you kind of modify the activity before changing the weights. And this prospective configuration is kind of like a fancy name which we have given to this way of learning, but this is nothing new. It's a principle which is kind of present with a wide family of models, which are known as the energy-based models. So this is kind of a family of models in computational neuroscience, where the activity evolves to reduce a particular energy function, which is a function describing some kind of constraints which we want the network to satisfy. And there's many examples of such networks. So the kind of the first examples were introduced by Hopfield, well known as the Hopfield networks, and more recently there are predictive coding networks, which have been originally proposed by Ryan Ballard, developed by Friston, and also developed here in the University of Waterloo by Jeff and his colleagues. Okay, so what I will try to show you that with this prospective configuration, you can reduce interference during learning. So this principle allows you to learn new information while preserving knowledge which is already stored in the network. And the key phenomenon, to achieve this ability, it's critically important that you first need to infer the desired neural activity before plasticity. Because if you first infer the kind of desired neural activity, you can foresee some kind of side effects of learning which can be introduced by weight changes and correct them. So let me illustrate it on the example based on Canadian wildlife. So imagine that somewhere, so this is the kind of like a simple example which illustrates the principle and its kind of difference to backpropagation. So imagine that somewhere in British Columbia, there is a bear which usually hunts for salmon by this river. So in the brain of this bear, there would be some kind of associations learned between different stimuli it experiences. So for example, the brain will learn that whenever it sees the river, there is usually sound and smell of salmon. And will typically make such prediction while seeing the river. However, imagine that on a particular day, the bear has injured ear because maybe there was a fight with another bear and doesn't hear the sound of the river. So it has to kind of learn that for some time, there will be no sound. So initially, it has this kind of prediction error in the auditory cortex and has to kind of learn to correct it. And of course, backpropagation can solve this problem for us. So let me just kind of briefly tell you how it works. So in backpropagation, you will essentially propagate this error in the auditory cortex through all the layers. And one feature of backpropagation is that while you propagate the errors, you don't change the activity of the neurons. And in a moment, I will denote the activity with different colors, and you can see that activity is here all with the same color. And then once you propagated the errors, you will modify the weights. In particular, what backpropagation will do will reduce all the weights on the path from visual to auditory cortex. So the next time, next day when the bear comes to the river, it sees the river, the prediction of the sound will be reduced. So we can see that backpropagation solved our problem. But please note that this weight modification introduced interference, because by reducing these weights, we also reduce the prediction of the smell of the salmon. And because we reduce the weights here. So this network will predict less smell of the salmon. And this is kind of very striking because the smell was actually correctly predicted on the previous trial. And even though it was correctly predicted and we learned about something else, as a kind of side effect, this new knowledge was kind of interfering with existing knowledge, and we reduced the prediction of the smell. And our bear may not feel the smell and may go hungry. So prospective configuration proposes that learning progresses in a slightly different way. So what happens first is that before you modify the weights, you change the activity of the neurons. And you will basically adjust the activity such that the outputs are correctly predicted. And you can see that the pattern which arises here is kind of similar to what arises in backpropagation after learning. But here it arises already before learning. So that's why we call it like prospective configuration, because this is the kind of the pattern that should result from learning. And what also happens is that we constantly recalculate prediction errors. And in prospective configuration, there would be not only negative prediction errors here, but there would be also a positive prediction error here. So this neuron is active, but it doesn't get enough input with this new pattern. So there's a positive prediction error here. And what prospective configuration is doing is it modifies the weights here the same as backpropagation, but also compensates these weights because there is this positive prediction error. And the interference is reduced, and our bear can happily hunt for salmon. OK, so you may be wondering how such a phenomenon can arise in simple networks of neurons. So I will illustrate it, and throughout the talk, I will mostly focus on illustrating all the examples with predictive coding networks, which are probably the most popular type of the energy-based networks, but we generally feel that this is kind of like a general principle which can apply to many other models. And well, as Jeff already mentioned, predictive coding networks are sometimes difficult to understand, and sometimes people kind of struggle to understand them because they are described by this kind of complicated equations with this complicated concept of free energy. But to make it simpler, Yuhang came with this amazing mechanical analogy, which is a machine made of rods, nodes, and springs, which makes exactly the same computation as predictive coding networks. So let me, instead of starting with the models, with the networks themselves, let me explain you the machine, and then later I will show you how it corresponds to the neural network. And this machine is kind of very, very intuitive. So let me explain it with a very simple example. So let's consider a network where we have just 3 neurons connected with weights W. So in this mechanical analogy, activity of the neuron corresponds to the height of a node sliding on a vertical post. So in this example, this neuron has little activity, this one has medium activity, and this neuron is highly active. The connections between the neuron corresponds to a rod pointing from this node to another node, which is like an input to this neuron. And the height of this node is equal to the activity multiplied by weight. So the weight kind of corresponds to, controls the angle of this rod. And in predictive coding networks, the activity of neuron is not fixed to the input, but it's somehow, you can think about it as being connected with a spring, and the natural state of the spring is to be fully contracted. So we have this kind of the springs. And essentially, the whole dynamics of changes in neural activity and learning in this predictive coding network tries to contract all the springs. So try to minimize the potential elastic energy of all the springs. In fact, in this machine, the free energy is fully equivalent to the potential energy of all the springs. So let me kind of illustrate how this network works. So imagine that you are trying to do some kind of prediction with this network. So you provide some input, which could correspond to constraining the activity of this node. So we'll put a pin here. And then when the network is making predictions, we just let all other neurons relax. So we just move to reduce the energy. And if you let neurons relax, they will kind of go to the minimum energy state, which corresponds to all the springs being collapsed. And basically, all the inputs will be exactly equal to the activity, and the network will make a prediction. And please note that this network makes exactly the same prediction as artificial neural network with the same weights. So these predictive coding networks have the kind of close relationship with artificial neural networks. They make exactly the same prediction when they have the same weights. Now, during training, we provide both input and output patterns. So we'll constrain both ends of this network. So we have pins here. And then we, again, let the network relax. And if you do this, the network will converge to this state. So if we constrain both ends, we may not always be able to reduce the energy to 0. But still, there would be some kind of equilibrium. And once we cannot reduce the energy anymore by changing the activity, we will reduce the energy by modifying the weights. So we'll change the angles of the rods to contract the speed. So in this case, the weights will go higher. And basically, the network will make a larger prediction next time. So just to kind of give you more intuition for this, Johan made this simulation of this network. So basically, here are the neurons, here are the inputs to the neurons, and the weights of the connections is equal initially to 1. Oops. How do I start the presentation? Okay. Yeah, so there's network is first making a prediction. So basically, all the springs can collapse. Then the target pattern is provided, and it converges to some kind of equilibrium. Then the weights are modified, and then the prediction is made again. And you can see that now the network makes a prediction which is closer to the target pattern. Okay, so this machine has exactly the same dynamics as a neural network proposed by Ryan Ballard, the predictive coding network. So basically, you can essentially one-to-one map this machine to this particular architecture. And in this network, you have essentially 2 types of neurons. You have neurons which encode the variables represented, so they correspond to the height of the blue nodes. And there are so-called error neurons, which corresponds to the extension of the spring. And the network is set up in such a way that basically activity changes in exactly the same way as in the machine. So let me just provide some kind of intuition how you can get such behavior in this network. So first, the extension of the spring in the machine is equal to the difference between the activity of the neuron and the input from the previous layer. So in predictive coding networks, these error neurons essentially calculate the difference between the activity of the corresponding neuron and the input from the previous layer. So in this diagram, you have excitatory connections which are filled with plus and inhibitory connections which are open with minus. And you can see that there's excitatory connection. These weights are equal to 1. So you just subtract the current activity of this neuron, and you subtract the input from the neurons in the previous layer, which are scaled by weights W. And then these blue nodes in this predictive coding networks, the value nodes, are driven by the error nodes. So they are kind of driven by the tension of the springs. And you can think what happens in this network to this node. So this node has various forces acting on it. So there is a spring, this spring which pushes it down, and this spring which pushes it up, right? So basically, the springs act on node. And similarly here, you have the excitatory connection from the previous layer, because this spring will essentially move the neuron up, and inhibitory connection from the corresponding. And what is also magical about this predictive coding network, that the weight modification corresponds to so-called Hebbian plasticity, the local changes in synaptic weights. So during learning in this machine, we would increase this weight to just reduce the tension of the spring. And in this weight modification is actually equal in this model to the product of activity of these 2 neurons. And the kind of so the product of activity of presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron, which is kind of like in computational neuroscience, typically modeled as Hebbian plasticity. So all the learning in this network is fully local. Okay, so this is how these networks work. So of course I started with like a very trivial example. So now let's see something slightly more complicated, and let us see how this machine would solve the Salmon problem. So I will consider a very simple network with just 1 input, 1 hidden, and 2 output nodes. So this is the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, and the olfactory cortex. So at the beginning of the training, there's an error in the prediction of the in the auditory cortex. So there's the network predicts the sound. There's no sound, so there's a high error. And then when we let this network relax during learning, it will converge to this state, right? So this hidden node will go down, and because it will go down, there would be also error here in the olfactory cortex, in the node which was correctly predicted. So now, during learning, we'll just change the weights to contract all the corresponding strings. So essentially, we'll decrease this weight, increase this weight, so decrease this weight, but also increase this weight because there's a tension in the positive direction. And then on the next trial, the network will predict less sound, but will still predict the correct olfactory output. So this is just a cartoon. So you can ask yourself, does it really work if I simulate it? And so we can now simulate this super simple network in this very simple task and observe how it behaves. So what I will be plotting here, I will be plotting the activity of the output neurons during learning in this network. So this coordinate corresponds to the activity in the auditory cortex, and this is the olfactory cortex. So this is the kind of target which is incorrectly predicted at the beginning, and the correctly predicted target. So initially, the network predicts activity in both outputs. So this is the initial point in our learning trajectory. And we want the network to go here. So this is our target, right? So we want the network to predict the smell, but not the sound. Here, the dots show the changes in the output across learning in these different networks. And you can see that eventually both backpropagation and predictive coding networks will converge to the target. However, backpropagation makes a big detour, while the predictive coding network moves much more closely to the target, according to this kind of example which I showed you before. And of course, if you think about it, making incorrect prediction is not very good for animals in the wild, because it reduces your chances of survival, right? So you should be able to make the correct predictions not only at the end of your training, but also as you go along. And one thing which is kind of very striking about this picture is that in the space of output, the backpropagation doesn't move directly to the target. This is very surprising because, backpropagation is a gradient descent on loss function, right? So it moves in the gradient of the error. So it's very surprising that it doesn't move the outputs towards the target. But please note that if you're familiar with backpropagation, that backpropagation does the gradient descent in the space of weights. So in this example, there are 3 weights. So there's 3-dimensional space of weights. And in the space of weights, indeed, it moves to minimize the error, but it doesn't translate to movement towards the target in the space of output, which is really what matters for the network. And this is because the changes are made by backpropagation kind of independently. So you kind of consider each weight independently without considering the consequences of this modification and for modification of other weights. And because of this, some of these changes across layers may interfere with each other, and this doesn't give you the movement in the correct direction in the space of output. So here you can see that this very clearly. So with the color lines, you have the level lines for the loss to target, right? So this is the squared error. So the squared error is 0 here, and it increases. So there are circles going from the target, and they are stretched because the scales are slightly different on this axis. And you can see that none of the algorithms minimizes the gradient, right? So if you just follow the gradient in the space of weights, you would be kind of orthogonal to this level lines, right? While the backpropagation is not orthogonal, it kind of goes in a different direction, and predictive coding networks kind of follow this target more closely. Now we can define a measure. And first, I just want to say that this is not just an artifact of the small learning rate. So the reviewers couldn't believe that this is the case, and they were saying that this must be something to do with a too large learning rate. But even if you choose very small learning rate, you will have this big detour with backpropagation and much trajectory much closer to the target for predictive coding. So this issue is not connected with the learning rate. So now we can define this measure, which I will call target alignment, which tells me how much my learning trajectory moves towards the target. So if by I show with purple the change in the output after one iteration of learning, and red is my trajectory to the target, then I can define the target alignment as the cosine of this angle. So if the target alignment is 1, this angle is equal to 0, so I have no interference, while the larger this angle, the lower the target alignment, the higher will be the interference. And clearly in this example, predictive coding networks have higher target alignment than backpropagation. But you may ask, maybe this is some kind of like a carefully chosen example, and it will not generalize to bigger networks. But actually, with bigger networks, the difference becomes even more striking. So this is an experiment which Yuhang made, where he designed like random networks with different number of layers, going from 1 to 25. And each network had 64 neurons in a layer. Weights were just initialized randomly. And there was just one iteration of training on one randomly generated input and output pattern, right? And he measured the target alignment in this one iteration of training. And here this target alignment is plotted for different, so each point is one simulation, and it's plotted for as a function of number of layers. So what you can see that if you do not have any hidden layers, so if you're just one layer, both predictive coding and backpropagation would perfectly move you towards target, right? So there is no kind of interference of the weights in different layers. But as the number of hidden layer increases, the backpropagation starts to move away, yes, and the target alignment becomes lower, while in predictive coding, this target alignment is still maintained at quite high value. So we had a plot like this in a, yes, please.
So that's like the cosine, it's still a negative value, is actually pointing in the wrong direction.
Yes, exactly. So exactly. So we had like long debates with the reviewers about this manuscript. And in the third iteration, reviewer 4 just wrote that clearly the backpropagation will move you in the direction of the target within 90 degrees. And but actually, there are instances where the backpropagation actually the target alignment is negative. So even though you minimize the loss function, it may happen that in the space of output, you move in the direction opposite the direction of the target, and this happens when you have a lot of layers, when there's a high chance of such interference. So this is a very striking. Yes, we are looking forward to hearing the reaction of reviewer 4. Okay, if you are one of the people in the audience, I apologize. Okay, so now you may ask whether this will target alignment will translate to some kind of learning abilities of these networks. So to investigate this, Yuhang trained these networks on a fashion MNES dataset, which is like a standard benchmark in machine learning, where you kind of classify pictures of different clothing items into like trousers, shirts, and so on. And here you can see, for example, the test error of neural networks with 15 layers as the training progresses for predictive coding in blue and backpropagation in orange. So to quantify the speed of learning, we could just take the mean test error, right? Because if you have a error which decreases quickly, like this blue line, this mean test error will be lower. And another thing which you have to control when you do this kind of experiments, you have to kind of make sure that you choose the learning rate optimally, because different algorithms may have different optimal learning rates. So in all the simulations which we are doing, we are testing the performance for the range of learning rates. So you can see, for example, here the mean test error of the networks with 15 hidden layers with different learning rates, and we always compare the simulations for the best learning rate for a given model. So, for example, these two curves are from the best learning rates for the given model, and you can see that even if you take the best learning rate with this kind of deeper networks, predictive coding needs much fewer learning iterations than backprop. And then here you can see how the mean of the test error depends on the number of layers. So you kind of see two effects on this graph. So first, all these curves have U-shaped, are U-shaped, because when you have very few layers, you have high mean test error because you are unable to learn the task. When the number of layers is really large, then it takes you a long time to train such a big network. So that's why this error is also large. But most importantly, you can see that as the number of hidden layer increases, the gap between these two algorithms is getting bigger and bigger. So when you have deeper networks, you have this kind of really advantage of prospective configuration, which is connected with the fact that it has higher target alignment. Yes. Yes, this is with nonlinear, and I think these are sigmoid units. Yes. So I think that we did this experiment with linear networks because we just wanted to say that it's not connected with nonlinearity. Yeah? So this is the kind of the simplest situation which we could have. But I think that all the experiments which I will be showing later will be with nonlinear networks. That's a great question. So so here in the simulation we have batches of 32 training items. So we are doing batch normalization, but I will address your question of batches in 2 slides. Any other questions? Yes. No, this is fully batch learning. Yes. Okay. So all these questions very nicely lead me to my next point. That then we kind of not. I would like to show you that this prospective configuration gives you advantage in various situations which are similar to the situations which animals and humans need to face during training. And to assess it, we are still using benchmarks from machine learning because machine learning has this kind of like really nice benchmark for assessing performance of networks. However, we used variants of these problems which are kind of a little bit more similar to what the brain would have to experience. And the first kind of task or situation we considered was connected with the question there, was a question with batch training. So those of you who are not familiar with kind of machine learning, let me kind of briefly introduce that when you train artificial neural networks, typically what you do is you present multiple training items, and for each synaptic weight, you calculate how this weight should be modified for each item, but you don't modify this weight yet. And then you average all this weight modification and you basically only change the weight based on this average. And this is because in backpropagation, these individual weight modifications are very noisy. So you want to kind of average them first before you modify the weights. But of course, the brain cannot learn like this. We cannot just store the information in a batch and then modify our synaptic weights. We have to modify our weights after each experience. And if you do this, then predictive coding indeed has an advantage. So now we have a small network with just 4 layers, but you can see the mean test error as a function of batch size. And the performance is very similar when the batch size is large, but when the batch size becomes smaller, there's an advantage of this predictive coding networks. And also the minimum of the test error is lower when you, so this is the minimum of the test error when there's no batch training. So we kind of wanted to test each of the assumption of the training one by one. And so this is the only simulation which has batch size 1. All the other simulation will have batch size 32. And this is because we kind of wanted to assess each of the kind of features of the scenarios one by one. So now the next question, we are moving to the kind of continual learning type problems. And another task where we see big advantages of predictive coding networks are the tasks where you have to learn some of the new information but preserve knowledge existing in the network. So this is the kind of the problem is very similar to this kind of salmon problem, which I introduced at the beginning. So to make it slightly more challenging for the network, Yuhang simulated, again, the fashion MNES task, but every few hundred training epochs, he would shuffle some of the labels, which are shown here in color, while keeping other labels intact. Yes. So the network had to relearn parts of its knowledge while keeping other parts of the knowledge intact. And here you can again see the performance of this networks. And indeed, there is very significant advantage of prospective configuration over backpropagation. So predictive coding networks are able to get almost half of the test error which is obtained by backpropagation. And again, these simulations are for the best learning rate for each algorithm. We also see some kind of small advantage in the situations where there's small size of the data set, which is again something which the animals and humans have to face. In continual learning problems, where you have to train the network with two different tasks. So in this example, this was again fashion MNES, but now the data set was split into two halves, one half containing 5 classes and the other half containing the other 5 classes. And it had to kind of alternate between learning these two data sets. And again, you can see that with time, there's an advantage of predictive coding over backpropagation. And another, yes? No, no. Yes, exactly. You kind of alternate between the tasks. You also try maybe like dividing four tasks. For 2 tasks, generally you don't allow forgetting the task, but for longer, bigger factors for that. So we haven't played much with this, but if you would like to play, I would be delighted. Yeah. Okay, and another kind of family of tasks where we see quite big advantage of the predictive coding networks are reinforcement learning tasks. So in reinforcement learning tasks, you can train the network to predict the expected reward for a given action in various kind of benchmark problems. And there is quite significant advantage in the total reward, which is obtained, which is in blue for, again, predictive coding and orange in backpropagation. And this is because if you're kind of familiar with reinforcement learning, the target value which you train this network to predict is not only the immediate reward, but it's the total reward expected in the future, where this future reward is computed by the network itself. So if you have any fluctuations in the output of these networks, they will only kind of magnify, and therefore the kind of the fluctuations present in the propagation are kind of deteriorating the performance in this reinforcement learning task. Okay, so so far I kind of try to argue that this prospective configuration gives you advantages in various situations which animals have to face. And kind of from evolutionary perspective, you may think that indeed the evolution might have favored the animals which kind of employ efficient learning algorithms. So there's a chance that something like this is kind of employed in the brain. So now we want to kind of see if we can see any kind of signatures of this kind of prospective configuration in experimental data, either from neural activity or behavior. And if you look at learning literature, there are several studies which actually suggest that the brain infers latent state during learning. So there are papers we proposed, before learning, we first infer some kind of learning states, and then we modify our knowledge or our model based on this kind of inferred latent state. But all these kind of models which have been proposed for this are very abstract Bayesian models, which are kind of not mechanistic. So what we are proposing is that this inference of the latent state could be implemented in this predictive coding networks or with prospective configuration in general, when the neurons in the hidden layers converge to this kind of prospective pattern of activity, which encodes this latent state. And then we kind of we demonstrated that some of the data from this existing studies can be naturally explained with prospective configuration or predictive coding networks. And I think that the kind of the most striking experiment is connected with inference during motor learning. So in this study, participants received different motor perturbations in different contexts and had to learn to compensate for these perturbations. And then the behavioral data from the study suggests that after receiving the feedback, the participants were able to infer the context and use this inferred context to update the weight. So let me just kind of show you how this data look like and how the various models can try to account for it. So in this experiment, the participants had to move like a manipulandum from starting position to a target position. But they were also experiencing perturbation. And for example, there was a positive perturbation in this example, and they had to kind of learn to compensate for this perturbation. And the experiment was designed such that there were two contexts, here represented with a blue background and red background, where in the blue background there was a positive perturbation, so it's B+, and in the red background there was negative perturbation, R-. And these trials were kind of interleaved, so the participants could kind of associate these different contexts with these different perturbations and learn to compensate for this. So now, if you think about mind of the participants, they have a perceptual input, they have the prediction of the perturbation which needs to be made, and maybe there is some kind of hidden state corresponding to the belief of being in one context versus another, which I will, in this case, denote with a bracket. So the authors of the studies ask whether, how participants can infer this belief state. So, but this belief is associated with both perceptual input and the motor perturbation. So, it could be in principle either inferred from the color of the background or from the feedback. So, can this belief state be activated by perturbation, namely by the output, before learning? And in order to do this, they were presenting participants with trials where the positive perturbation was provided without blue background. So there was this R+ trials where there was a positive perturbation but no blue background, and they were really interested in if this perturbation, participants will be inferring this blue background and kind of modify its knowledge about this particular context. So the experiment was kind of designed in the following way. That first there was a training session with these two perturbations in two contexts. Then there was some kind of washout session just to wash out the kind of immediate strong memory of this perturbation. And then there was a testing session where they provided 4 trials with different combination of perturbation and background. And before these 4 testing trials, there were 2 kind of measuring trials where they presented blue background and measured perturbation. So no perturbation was, measured compensation. So no perturbation was provided, but they kind of measured the compensation of the participant. So they were interested in the following question. When they present these trials with positive perturbation and red background, will there be a difference in adaptation between these 2 trials? Yes. So, because if there is a difference, it means that somehow the participants activated the blue context. from this perturbation. Right? And if the context was not activated from the perturbation, just activated from the stimulus, there should be no learning about the blue context from this trial. Yes, this is a quite complicated paradigm. So if you have any questions, it took me a long time to kind of understand myself. Please feel free to ask for clarification. Okay, so and indeed, this is what they observe. So here you can see how much the participants changed the adaptation between these two trials, and depending on the test trials which was provided here. And not surprisingly, the biggest change was for B+, because it was a trial when there was a blue background. But surprisingly, there was quite big change in adaptation when they presented the positive perturbation with red background, which is not something predicted kind of like by backpropagation, where so it kind of signifies that somehow the participants needed to infer this context from the feedback. And then we can naturally simulate this with a very simple predictive coding network. So again, this figure shows kind of like a minimal model which simulates this task. So this network has basically like 6 neurons. So there are 2 input neurons which denote the color of the background, 2 output neurons which encode the predicted perturbation, and we have these hidden neurons which encode the beliefs. And in this minimal model, we have just one-to-one connections here and fully connected network here. But like we also tested bigger models, and they have the same results. I think this is the simplest one to explain. So now you can kind of see what will happen in this model as the training progresses. So when you train this kind of model, the blue background gives positive perturbation and red background gets negative perturbation. You create strong connections here and weak connections here. Now, when you have some kind of washout session, then these connections kind of will be reduced, but there will be a trace of them remaining. And now, during this testing trial, when you provide this red background with positive perturbation, during training, you activate this neuron because this is the red background and positive perturbation. And now, when you let the network relax, then this neuron will also get activated. You can imagine now my machine or Yuhang's machine and see that this neuron will also get activated. And then once you modify the weights, you will basically strengthen these connections. And when you simulate this network, it indeed predicts a kind of qualitatively similar pattern of activity as the data. By contrast, if you try to simulate backpropagation network with the same architecture, you will not produce any learning for the red pattern, because when you provide the red pattern, this neuron is not active, and if you are familiar with backpropagation learning rules, you will not change the activity if the presynaptic, you will not change any weights if the presynaptic neuron is inactive. Yes. So this is an example where the predictive coding networks can reproduce this inference of latent state while backpropagation cannot. How much time do I still have? 5 minutes. Okay, so we have more experiments, but I will skip them. Okay, so just very briefly. Another quite nice experiment is connected with reinforcement learning, so this is the study which suggests that humans are able to kind of learn a model of the task during reinforcement learning. So in these experiments, participants had to choose between 2 options, and were receiving either $1 reward or losing $1 reward. And the probability of getting reward for each option was set such that one option had high probability, the other one had low probability. And from time to time, the probability swapped. But if one went up, the other always went down. And remarkably, the imaging data from the study suggests that humans are able to acquire this model of the task and realized that there's this kind of anti-correlation of the rewards from these two options. And basically, when they modify the weights for one option, they modify the expected value for the other option in the opposite way. And this is kind of based on activity in medial prefrontal cortex, which is the active part of the brain which reflects the value expected by participants. And this graph shows the activity in this area on the trials following loss. So imagine that there's a trial when participant lost. And then on the next trial, there are two options. Either the participant could stay with the same option or switch to the other option. Here you can see the activity of the value encoding area in the brain on the loss trial and the next trial when you have a stay and when you have switch. So unsurprisingly, if you stay with the same option, on the next trial you expect less reward. But remarkably, when you lost and you switch, then on the next trial you actually expect more reward, as if the participants knew that, if this option is bad, maybe this other option is really good. So they actually were increasing the value estimate for the other option. Again, we simulated a simple model, and prospective configuration can reproduce this pattern while backpropagation cannot. And the key to reproducing is that we have this kind of hidden node which can encode the latent state, which in this case describes which of these two options is rewarded and kind of can dynamically modify its value during learning. Okay, so just wanted to kind of finish with discussion of some more general points connected with relationship between prospective configuration and backpropagation. So in the past, our group was very interested in how to get the predictive coding networks to do backpropagation exactly, because we thought that backpropagation is the kind of gold standard we should aim to achieve. And there are several ways in which you can do it. So for example, you can make the springs on the output layer weak. Yes. So basically, the way you get backpropagation in this predictive coding networks, you somehow have to do a trick which prevents the activity of hidden neurons from changing before learning, right? Because if you don't change the activity of hidden neurons, you cannot get back. And you can achieve it, for example, by making the springs on the output layer weak. And if the springs on the output layer are weak, then the activity of all the hidden neurons will change very little, and you get convergence to weight modification in backprop. And you can also do other things. But now we realize that this change of the neural activity before plasticity is not a bug. It's a feature. It's a key feature of this predictive coding networks. And it has been, previously thought to be kind of necessary cost of approximating backpropagation. But now we see that it's not. That this is the key feature which allows this networks to achieve better performance in many tasks which the animals and humans have to face, and also explain experimental data from diverse learning tasks. Also, I wanted to kind of point out that this prospective configuration may be one of the answers of how the brain tries to solve the plasticity stability dilemma. So experimental data suggests that even in the adult brain, synaptic weights are modified in primary visual cortex. So if weights are modified in primary visual cortex, the representation downstream will be completely destroyed. So how is it possible that we can see anything? Yes? Well, prospective configuration provides one of the answers, because it's a learning mechanism which has this property that when you modify some connections, you ensure that the other knowledge in the network is preserved. And of course, this is not the only mechanism proposed for reducing interference. There were other very interesting mechanisms proposed by other people as well. And it's highly likely that all these mechanisms operate in parallel and kind of jointly contribute to reduction of the interference. And another thing which I wanted to say, that a feature of predictive coding networks, which I really, really like, is that they operate completely autonomously. And the only way you need to control this network is by is to provide certain inputs. Or, in my energy machine or Newhank's energy machine, you have to kind of pin certain nodes to certain positions. And this is the only control you provide. Yes, if you and then all the network, all the computation and plasticity will just happen as a result of this. Yes, so if you just constrain the input layer of this network, the network will make a prediction because all the errors will converge to 0. So all the springs will collapse. And because all the springs will collapse, there is no plasticity, because the plasticity is not necessary, because the plasticity is to reduce the energy. It cannot be reduced anymore by changes in activity. By contrast, if you want to train this network, you will constrain both inputs and outputs, and the network will naturally converge to some state and then update its weight. So there's no any kind of little homunculus needed to route information to this network or tell the network when to do plasticity, when not to do plasticity. Everything happens kind of fully autonomously. Okay, so in summary, during this talk, we proposed that cortical network infer desired pattern of activity before plasticity. And this principle of prospective configuration enables more effective learning in many situations which are faced by animals and humans in the natural environment, and it's necessary to explaining some data from more complex learning tasks. So I wanted to thank my group, and in particular thank Newhank. And if you are interested in learning more about this, we have a preprint available on biology. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. I can get us started. I have a question. Can you comment on the computational